That night Bob Dylan left the microphone on stage, and what he did without it became the silent moment told in rock history for 40 years. The music never played, but everyone changed. Philadelphia. The Tower Theater. March 1978. A sold-out crowd waiting in that particular darkness that only exists before a Bob Dylan concert. The kind of darkness filled with expectation and uncertainty. Because with Dylan, you never knew what you'd get. A protest singer who'd stopped protesting. A folk hero who'd gone electric. A poet who'd started painting. A voice of a generation who'd spent 15 years trying to escape that title. The stage was set. Instruments in place. Microphones stand center stage, catching the single spotlight. The crowd murmured, shifted, waited. Dylan walked on alone. No band. No introduction. Just a man in his late 30s, weathered beyond his years, carrying the weight of every word that had ever been written about him. He wore a simple dark shirt, his hair wild and curling at the edges. He moved slowly, deliberately, like someone who'd learned that speed solved nothing. He reached the microphone. Stood there. The crowd erupted, that roar of recognition, of relief, of people who'd waited months for tickets and hours in their seats, and now finally Bob Dylan was here. Dylan didn't acknowledge the applause. He never did. He stood at the microphone for exactly 7 seconds. His right hand reached toward it, fingers hovering an inch from the metal, not quite touching. Then his hand dropped. He turned away from the microphone, walked to the edge of the stage, and stopped. The applause faltered. Confusion rippled through the crowd like a wave moving backward. Dylan stood at the stage edge, looking into the darkness where 3,000 people sat invisible to him, and he didn't move. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The kind of silence that becomes physical, that presses against your chest. People began glancing at each other, uncertain. Was this part of the show? Was something wrong? Should someone do something? In the wings, Dylan's tour manager, Victor Maymudes, felt his stomach drop. He'd worked with Dylan for 15 years. He'd seen the electric controversy at Newport. He'd been there when Dylan crashed his motorcycle and disappeared for 18 months. He'd watched Dylan turn away from protest songs and angry folkas and everything people expected him to be. But he'd never seen this. Victor started toward the stage. Dylan's hand came up, a small gesture, barely visible in the darkness. Stop. Stay back. Victor stopped. Dylan stood at the stage edge for another 40 seconds. Then he turned around, walked past the abandoned microphone, and moved to a simple wooden chair that had been set up stage right. He sat down. Waited. The confusion in the crowd was becoming vocal now. Whispers, nervous laughter, someone calling out, "Bob? You okay?" Dylan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a harmonica. Not in a holder. Just the instrument itself, small and silver in his hand. He held it up slightly, showing it to the crowd, then lowered it to his lap. And he began to play. No microphone. No amplification. Just the raw sound of a harmonica played by a man sitting on a wooden chair on a stage meant for rock concerts. The crowd went silent again. Different silence this time. The silence of people straining to hear something barely audible. The harmonica was quiet. You could only hear it if you stopped breathing, stopped moving, stopped everything. Dylan played for 2 minutes. A melody nobody recognized. Slow. Mournful. The kind of tune you'd play on a porch at dusk, not for an audience but for yourself, because the silence was too heavy without it. When he finished, he lowered the harmonica. Looked at the crowd he still couldn't see. And spoke without a microphone, his voice barely carrying past the first few rows. "I can't be who you need me to be," he said. "Not tonight." Then he stood up, walked past the microphone one more time, and left the stage. The house lights came up. 3,000 people sat in stunned silence, looking at an empty stage with a microphone nobody had used. The concert was over. It had lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand what happened 6 weeks earlier. Dylan had been touring for 18 months straight. The Rolling Thunder Revue had ended, but the pressure to perform hadn't. Stadiums, arenas, theaters. Night after night of 3,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 people who all wanted something from him. Wanted the protest singer. Wanted the folk hero. Wanted the young Dylan who'd written "Blowin' in the Wind" and "The Times They Are Changin'." But that Dylan didn't exist anymore. Maybe he never had. Maybe he'd been a collective hallucination, something people needed to see so badly they'd created it out of a 20-year-old kid with a guitar and a chip on his shoulder. In January 1978, Dylan was in a hotel room in Boston. Post-concert. Exhausted. He'd done 2 hours on stage, given them everything they wanted. The hits, the deep cuts, the harmonica solos, the attitude. They'd loved it. Standing ovation. 3 encores. And Dylan felt nothing. There was a knock at the door. His tour manager. "Bob, there's someone here to see you. Says it's important." Dylan almost said no. He always said no to these requests. But something in Victor's voice made him pause. "Who is it?" "He says his name is Thomas. Thomas Aldrich. Says he saw you play at the Gaslight in 1962. The Gaslight Cafe. Greenwich Village. Before Newport. Before the fame. When Dylan was nobody, playing for tips and free coffee, sleeping on friends' couches, trying to figure out who Bob Dylan even was. "Send him in," Dylan said. The man who entered was 57, gray-haired, wearing a worn jacket that had seen better decades. He stood in the doorway like someone who wasn't sure he belonged there. "Mr. Dylan? I'm sorry to bother you. I know you're tired. I needed to tell you something." Dylan gestured to a chair. "Sit." Thomas sat on the edge of the seat, hands clasped. "I saw you at the Gaslight. February 1962. You played Song to Woody and Hard Times in New York Town. There were maybe 30 people there. I was one of them." Dylan nodded slowly, remembering. Barely remembering. That had been a lifetime ago. "I was going through something back then," Thomas continued. "My wife had left me. I'd lost my job. I was living in a basement apartment in the village with nothing but a record player and too much time to think. I was planning to end it. That week. I'd already written a note. The hotel room was very quiet. I went to the Gaslight because I had $12 left and figured I'd spend it on music before He stopped. "And then you played. And I don't know how to explain this, but something in those songs, not the words, exactly, but the way you sang them. Like you knew what it felt like to be nobody. To be lost. To be trying to figure out if any of it mattered." Thomas looked at Dylan directly for the first time. "I didn't kill myself. I walked out of that club and I didn't do it. And I built a life. Got married again. Had 2 daughters. Became a teacher. And every time things got hard, I remembered that night. Some kid in a cafe playing guitar like it was the only honest thing left in the world." Dylan said nothing. His face showed nothing. "I'm dying now," Thomas said simply. "Cancer. Few months left. And I needed to find you. Needed to tell you that you saved my life. Not because you were trying to. Not because you knew. But because you played music like it mattered." He stood up. "That's all. I'm sorry for bothering you. I just needed you to know that one person, one night, one performance that probably didn't mean anything to you, it meant everything." Thomas left. Dylan sat alone in that hotel room until dawn, staring at nothing. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. 2 days later, Dylan called Victor. "Cancel the next 3 shows. Bob, we can't. The venues are sold out." The promoters will cancel them. Refund everyone. I don't care about the money. What's wrong? Are you sick? No, Dylan said. I'm trying not to be. Dylan went home. Not to his mansion, but to a small cabin he owned in upstate New York that almost nobody knew about. No phone. No electricity beyond a generator. No way for the world to reach him. He stayed there for 3 weeks. He didn't write songs. Didn't play guitar. Didn't do anything that resembled the Bob Dylan people expected. He chopped wood. He sat on the porch. He read books. He thought about Thomas Aldrich and the Gaslight Cafe and being 20 years old, and nobody. On the 3rd week, he picked up his harmonica. Not to perform. Not to practice. Just to play. The way he used to before anyone was listening. Before it meant something to mean something. He played for himself. Slow melodies. Half-formed tunes. Nothing that would ever become a song. Just sounds that filled the silence. And sitting there on that porch, harmonica in hand, Dylan understood something he'd been running from for 15 years. He'd become a symbol. The voice of a generation. The conscience of the 60s. The protest poet. The folk hero. The sellout. The genius. The fraud. Whatever people needed him to be, they'd made him that. And he'd spent 15 years trying to escape it, trying to prove he was something else, trying to be unpredictable and unknowable and anything but the box they'd put him in. But Thomas Aldrich hadn't come to that hotel room because of blowin' in the wind. He'd come because of a kid in a basement cafe playing music like it mattered. Before the symbol. Before the expectations. When it was just sound and silence, and trying to figure out if anything was real. Dylan had spent 15 years running from being a symbol. What he should have been running from was forgetting how to be human. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. When Dylan returned to the tour in Philadelphia, he told Victor one thing. I'm going to do something different tonight. Different how? I don't know yet, Dylan said. But I'm going to stop pretending. Victor had no idea what that meant. Dylan walked onto that Tower Theater stage with a plan that wasn't a plan. He was going to see what happened when he stopped being Bob Dylan the symbol and tried to remember how to be Bob Dylan the human. When he stood at that microphone and couldn't touch it, it wasn't a gimmick. It wasn't performance art. It was genuine paralysis. The weight of 15 years of expectation pressing down on him, and the realization that he couldn't do this anymore. Couldn't pretend. Couldn't perform being the person they needed. So he walked away from the microphone. Walked to the edge of the stage. And stood there trying to figure out what came next. The harmonica wasn't planned. He'd brought it on instinct, stuffed in his jacket pocket. When he sat down and played it without amplification, he was playing the way he played at the Gaslight in 1962. For himself. For the silence. Not for 3,000 people but for the one person who might need to hear that sometimes even legends don't have answers. When he said, I can't be who you need me to be, he wasn't apologizing. He was telling the truth for the first time in years. The crowd didn't understand that night. The reviews were savage. Dylan walks off stage after 4 minutes. Concert disaster in Philadelphia. Refunds were demanded. Lawsuits threatened. But 17 people wrote letters to Dylan's management in the following weeks. 17 people who said that 4-minute concert changed their lives. That watching someone admit they couldn't carry the weight anymore gave them permission to put down their own. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. Dylan never spoke about that night publicly. But 6 months later, he recorded an album in a small studio with no audience. Slow Country, it was called. It sold poorly. Critics called it his weakest work. But Thomas Aldrich's daughter wrote Dylan a letter saying her father had listened to it every day in hospice until he died. The microphone from that Philadelphia stage was never used again. Dylan had it removed from his tour. It sits now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, labeled simply, the one he walked away from. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop performing and remember how to be human.